Hi, everybody. Welcome to week 10 of your visual arts class. I hope you're all well and enjoying this kind of chilly weather. I want to remind you that next week you will have lectures for every class except for mine. Because remember, I did a lecture on the week that you had your midterm. So next week you'll have Professor McNeil, Professor McBride, and Professor Nippon's lectures, but you will not see one from me. And then I'll be back after Thanksgiving. Today, we're going to do a lecture about architecture in the United States. Okay, and there's a lot of different architectures, and American architecture begins in the 17th century when colonists began to arrive in the United States. And the settlers were coming from different places. At first, they came from England, and then they came from Germany, and they came from different places. And with them, they brought in the building techniques that they had in their countries. Remember, too, that they are limited to the supplies and materials that they can find in the United States, and also whether or not they're building on rocky areas or plains and smooth areas near the coast. So they brought these styles with them from their homelands, and the early American houses started in different ways. Colonial architecture was really kind of hit or miss when it was in the United States. People did the best with the knowledge that they had and the materials that they had. There were only two places in the United States where trained builders were sent to build houses and structures. One was in New Orleans, or New Orleans, as they say, in Louisiana. There, the French sent builders to help build the city. And we're going to take a look at that in a little bit. So they had excellent architecture there because they had skilled craftspeople building and people who could design the houses, etc. Where when the colonists first came, they used what they had. They built small things. Sometimes they moved into Indian huts, Native American huts, because it was so cold and they had so little time to build, they took whatever shelter they could take. The second part in the United States in the early colonization time that had professional builders was in Florida, especially in St. Augustine, where the Spanish built their towns and their homes. And they too sent professional builders and craftsmen to those areas. The first thing that I'd like to show you is a video that talks about building in colonial times so that you can get an idea of what that was like. We'll do a little discussion with that, and then we'll see a video about New Orleans and their architecture. So let's look at this video first. Okay, so we've learned here. Okay, so we're looking at this, again, you're looking at the houses for colonial times. I just want to give you a brief history on that. All right, so you saw that the building was very simple, that they were actually using trees that were together as supports for their homes. You saw that they used grasses and reeds that grew nearby, just like we saw with Native Americans when they were doing things. They used reeds and wove them, and again, this clay mud works as like a mortar or a cement on the walls. So the architecture back in colonial days was very primitive. But remember, I said that in New Orleans and in Florida, they sent master builders. I want you to take a look a little bit at this short video about New Orleans and see the difference and how intricate and how decorative and how different the architecture is in those areas where materials are brought over from France and master builders are doing the architecture. Take a look at this. So in the background where the young man was talking about voodoo, which is a religious practice by some of the Creoles, you saw buildings that looked a lot different than what they did in early American times in the colonies. They had shutters that were closed, but they were made more of a stucco. Some had 2 levels. They were much more civilized, much more advanced than what we saw when we were looking at the early American business buildings. So many were 1 floor, but they also had ones that had a 2nd floor towards the back. And many of them were called shotgun homes, where if you stood at the back of the home and you fired a shotgun, there'd be no wall or anything in the way to stop the bullet from flying through the house and defending your family. So balustrades were built, balconies were built, metal was used. And this happened quite early, again, because we are talking about master builders coming. When we talk about the Spanish in Florida, we talk about the St. Augustine, which is the oldest town in Florida, and it is done again with mud for like a stucco, but much more advanced in its building. And then when we talk about when the Dutch came to the United States, we see many old homes, especially in New York, which was the first capital and was also called New Amsterdam, where the roofs were set like this and like this and like this, because that was the shape of a bottom of a boat. So many of the builders that came were shipbuilders. So they took the trade that they knew and they put that into building homes. So if you're walking through older areas in New York, you will see these roofs that start like this and go down like this and then come like this. And if you look carefully, you will see that that house was built by the Dutch, and that shape is set up in the shape of the bottom of a ship. So in New England, the settlers would do wood, and they'd have later on a chimney so that they could keep warm and they could cook. In the South, the material of choice became later on brick, where plantations were being built later on, going before the Civil War. Bricks, they could make bricks down there, so much of their building was done with bricks, contrasting to the architecture that we were seeing in the Northeast, where, as you saw in the early pictures, wood was being used, okay? And so a lot of important buildings like state houses and that sort of thing, capitol buildings, were built with brick. So we're going to move on to a time which is called the Beaux-Arts, B-E-A-U-X art, beautiful arts time of architecture in the United States. And this type came from the classical and Roman architecture. So it's got columns, it's very formal, it has pedestals, and we see things like that, say in Monroe's house, James Monroe's house, and in the building of the Capitol building. And they'd have balconies, very formal. When you think about the Parthenon in picture of the Parthenon in Greece, you think of those tall columns. Well, we started to adopt that in our architecture in the Beaux-Arts. So let me show you a little bit about what that looked like. Look at these columns. So now when you take a trip to Washington, DC, you can talk about how you know about the Beaux-Arts movement and neoclassicism and where it came from. You saw all those columns. Those buildings are majestic. They make you think of grandness. And now we realize that they're supposed to symbolize equality and the rights of everyone. So the Beaux-Arts movement, and they're talking about Thomas Jefferson in this because he did a lot of planning and building during that time in the US Capitol, was inspired by Greek and Roman architecture. So I thought that was kind of neat. Now let's look. Towards the end of the colonial period, the styles of architecture and then moving to Greek buildings were coming to into play, and they were called Federalist buildings, state capitals. All of those used that type of style because it looked majestic and it looked strong and it stood for different rights of people. So we're moving from the simplistic to a much more stylized time. And then we also start to look at the same time another style begins, and it's an English-based Gothic style, and it's very popular. And you begin to see this when they're building a lot of churches. And remember that the United States is founded on religious rights without discrimination. That's why the English come to the United States, because they're beginning to feel persecuted and they want to be able to practice their religion in any way without persecution. So here we're going to see some really big things that are built, a lot of churches and cathedrals, one of which is very well known to you, and I want to show you a little bit about it, and you can look at the artwork from this time, where we see this grandiose building. John Renwick designed St. Patrick's Cathedral with flying buttresses and beautiful windows. And I want you to look at the architecture of this. And since it's in New York and we're in New York, I thought you would like to see this as well. That's if I can get that. So you saw this architecture of St. Patrick's Cathedral. And one of the things that you heard them say was, if it was just Gothic, it would have been much darker without such bright white marble and all of these beautiful windows. But this is it's based on the Gothic style, but a neo-Gothic, a change in it. So when you go to New York and you look at St. Patrick's Cathedral, you think about the spires, the arches, all of the different uses of the stained glass, the work at the altars that were all carved and metalwork there, all giving you a certain feeling. And remember, the docent who's talking about this is telling us that it's supposed to make you feel like God is good. God has done great things. As you look up to the ceilings that are high and arched, a feeling of going towards heaven. It gives a creation like that. So I thought that you'd be interested in seeing that architecture. But then there's something else that I'd like to talk to you about, a bridge, the Brooklyn Bridge, done by a man named Robles, who had a vision to connect Brooklyn and Manhattan. So he decides he's going to build this bridge. One of the things that he comes up against is that he's got to make stanchions, pilings, so that they could support the bridge. And they start something called caissons. Caissons are when they start to drill underneath the water to get to the bedrock so that they can anchor the bridge. And they had to do different things because they were so far below. They had to do decompression chambers for the men who worked down there. Because if they came up too fast, it would be like a diver who would come up too fast from the bottom. And they would get the bends, a horrible plight that would come over them where air bubbles would be in their bloodstream. So this was a very difficult bridge to build. And Robles was building it, and he was thinking about doing this, and he was standing on a dock when another dock kind of moves in and crushes his foot. And he begins to have all kinds of issues because of this. And he finally dies. And the interesting thing is his wife, who's a really headstrong woman, is the one who continues to build and finish the Brooklyn Bridge. The Brooklyn Bridge still stands strong in New York. And I thought you'd get a big kick out of seeing another piece of architecture that we know of in New York and how it was built. And it was built in 1871. And it's built from reinforced concrete and steel. Let's take a look at this video. I just got to get this out of the way. Hold on. So that's a beautiful bridge. It's over 200 years old. And whenever you drive or come into Manhattan, you can pick it out because of the way it is made with all of those cables that come down. And it's interesting to think that something that stable could actually sway back and forth, but that's how it stays stable. All right, so now I want to talk about the functional designs that start to happen with architecture and housing. And one of them takes place in Chicago. And the man that we're going to talk about is Louis Sullivan. And then we're also going to talk about an architect named Frank Lloyd Wright. And Frank Lloyd Wright was the creator of type of architecture called Prairie Style. And he was known for his hanging balconies and very airy looking buildings. He also built the Guggenheim Museum, that round museum that we saw last week, where we saw artwork in there. And his buildings took place before World War I, and they take place in the Chicago area. And so he's looking at horizontal planes that are built on top of each other. So I want you to take a look first at the way that Louis Sullivan builds architecture in Chicago, and then we're going to switch over to Frank Lloyd Wright. Again, Louis Sullivan. So that was a good view of some great decorative architectural styles that we would see in Chicago and the start of skyscrapers. And the reason for that, as she said, was that they didn't have any room to go this way. They could only go up. And he felt that the decorative part of the art should be on different things. And you can see that today that still was true, because one of those buildings had a Target logo on it and was very, very ornate. Now, also with architecture at the time, stained glass became very important. And we did see that we see that for the churches, and we saw that with St. Patrick's. But, some of us will go to the jewelry store, Tiffany's, for their jewelry. And Tiffany was also involved in architecture. And as they said at the St. Patrick's Cathedral, the adornment along the altar rail was done by Tiffany at that time. And the artist that I'd like you to take a look at is someone called Louis Comfort Tiffany. And Louis Comfort Tiffany is known for his Tiffany lamps. You see those lamps with the stained glass on it. But he was also known for doing beautiful, beautiful stained glass windows as well. And he perfects a different technique on how to do stained glass, which they'll talk about. But I also want you to know that when Chester A. Arthur was the president of the United States, he felt that the White House was sort of gloomy. It needed to be spruced up. It needed to be sparked up. So he commissions Louis Comfort Tiffany to do different decorations and things throughout the White House. And he has him do work in the East Room, the Blue Room, and the State Dining Room as well. So let's look at some of the beautiful glass work that's done during this architectural period by Louis Comfort Tiffany, a relative who also does Tiffany as far as jewelry, and also look at his technique with stained glass. Okay, hold on. So you saw some beautiful stained glass windows. Of course, his other pieces, like the lamps, the lampshades, the jewelry, but those pieces are part of the architecture that we see as it develops through the time. So around 1900, an international style began, and it started to come with bright, vivid colors, different kinds of shapes, use of different materials, unusual materials. And again, one of the things that we think about with unusual shape is the Guggenheim Museum, which we saw last week in one of the lectures. So things started to be functional as far as style. More skyscrapers were built as land became smaller and that sort of thing. But now I want you to take a look at this.
You ever wonder what
So, oh, hold on. So when we're looking at that, when we're looking at the arts and crafts movement, we see how it developed from England and how it was brought over to the United States with the roof that overhangs right to the windows, or no decoration at all other than the beams. You talk about like a Tudor style where there's wood that crosses and makes patterns on the buildings. The arts and crafts movement also talked about these decorative doorways and arches that went over it. So that was also very, very influential in the architecture. So when we look at that and we look at all of the different types of things that we saw today, we saw progression in architecture from the very simple, from colonial times, moving to a little bit past that to when artisans and builders were sent to the New World to build. And we saw some things like in the background with the voodoo talking, with the houses and the shutters and the balconies of New Orleans, and talking about how the Spanish were influential in the architecture in France, and then how we moved on using artwork that Jefferson was looking at from France, with the columns that influenced our Capitol and buildings in Washington, D.C., and also state houses throughout the country, how we were using things from Greek art to show equality and structure and strength, to we move to other different types of art, to the arts and crafts movement, to the Beaux-Arts. So that kind of gives us an idea when we're looking at the Brooklyn Bridge, how that was influenced by the time and the need, and how the architecture of that bridge was changed because they had to build these stanchions in the water, and how they had to adapt for that so that men could go underneath to find the bedrock, to things like St. Patrick's Cathedral with its Gothic architecture, and how it inspires you to look upward with its spires and its arches and the light that comes in, to stained glass and architecture in the churches, and also in different buildings. And we saw about Louis Comfort Tiffany and how he was commissioned to work in the White House from President Chester A. Arthur to beautify the White House at a certain time with his stained glass. So architecture invokes a lot of things. It's simple homes, it's skyscrapers, it's bridges, it's glass work, it's patterns on the buildings, all things coming together. It's the need to go up to build because you can't go out anymore. It's Frank Lloyd Wright's vision of terracing a house. All of those things work to develop architecture in the United States. And you see these things resurface here and there, even in common homes. Sometimes you still see people putting gingerbread or decorative Victorian work around their homes, even though they're not Victorian, because that kind of resurges. Or we see when we drive down a community, we see the Tudor homes with the wood in it and sort of an arts and crafts kind of feel. And of course, when we visit places like St. Patrick's, so we see the Brooklyn Bridge, we see all of this art still lasting and still influencing our lives. So today's lecture was one to try and give you a taste of how architecture started, what parts of things can come together to make architecture, and to make you look around when you're in New York City and other places that you're visiting to see what types of architecture there are. Is it Gothic? Is it arts and crafts? Is it a prairie art? Are we recognizing Neo-Gothic and how it changed? Can we see how the Greek and Roman architecture influences our buildings? Maybe if you go to someplace near here, like Old Bethpage Restoration, or if you go to Jamestown, you can look at the simplistic building of the homes and buildings from the colonists to get a sense of how this word architecture worked in the United States. So I hope that you have a great week and I hope you have a wonderful Thanksgiving. Remember, I will not have a lecture next week, but the other 3 teachers will, and they will also have a lecture this week. So enjoy your holiday and I'll see you in December.